Everyone, this is going to be Chapter 14, Part 2, A New Birth of Freedom, the Civil War, except the second one. So, Chapter 14, Part 2, primary source is something we're going to look at in our next class, which is the Gettysburg Address, because it is super important and really poetic and only about 2 minutes long, so it fits in with our end of the semester plan. So, in this section, we're going to be looking at the Confederacy during the Civil War. We're also going to be looking at key turning points. And lastly, we'll look at the major impact that this had on the U.S. and the world as well. We're definitely going to talk about that more during Reconstruction, too. So, what's the Confederacy doing during this time? 14.1, we looked at the Union. Now let's look at the Confederacy. So, the only president of the Confederacy that ever was Jefferson Davis, and he had a rough time in office. He was a very accomplished senator, secretary of war, statesman. However, he seemed sort of cold and standoffish, especially compared with Lincoln's ability to connect with people, to tell a joke, to get people sort of at ease. Davis could never at ease people. The South had been used to leaders who let the states do what they wanted. I mean, that's partially why the Civil War happened, is they were looking for more states' rights. But Davis came to the conclusion relatively quickly that if he wanted to win this war, he was going to need some very strong national rights. He was going to need to create a strong national government, which is, of course, ironic, considering that's the very thing that he was trying to get away from along with the rest of the Confederacy. So here's Jefferson Davis, 1808 to 1889, from Kentucky, but moved to Mississippi. He was a former congressman from Mississippi, a senator, and secretary of war as well. After the war, Davis actually sold his plantation to one of his former slaves. He was later arrested, but he was pardoned by Andrew Johnson after just a little while in prison. So one of the big Southern problems they had was economics, and that was because they had been overly dependent upon cotton before and during the Civil War, actually. At first, Jefferson Davis tried to sort of get the South to start growing more food and less cotton to make them sort of self-sustaining, hoping to also as a way to possibly say to England and France that, hey, if you guys don't come over on our side, you're not going to get any more cotton from us. England and France had relied upon Southern cotton to fill up their textile mills. However, King Cotton diplomacy, as they called it, backfired. England ended up not intervening, partially because England was anti-slavery at this point, and so they weren't interested in recognizing a nation that enslaved people. But also partially because they needed northern wheat just as much as they needed southern cotton. And so when southern cotton dried up, England turned to Egypt and to India and to Russia instead, not to the south. Lastly, Jefferson Davis had trouble appeasing Southerners who believed that secession had come out of states' rights, and that therefore states' rights should be at the forefront of the Southern nation. The Southerners who were firm believers in states' rights hated the strong national government that Jefferson Davis formed. They considered a violation of the liberties for which they had separated from the United States. The state of Georgia straight up threatened to secede from the Confederacy if they didn't shape up. So, at the beginning of the Civil War, the Southern men generally flocked to the army with a great sense of patriotism, much like the North had, that we saw the numbers swell. And they spoke of the war as a fight for liberty, which again is kind of an ironic statement that one of these liberties is, as they say in the movie Lincoln, the freedom to oppress, the freedom to enslave is one of the freedoms they are fighting for. However, much like the North, Southerners started to sour against this war. Morale dropped during this time, especially once the draft got started. The draft got started in the South just like it did in the North, so you could be involuntarily forced to join the army. And one of the things that really rankled a lot of Southerners was that poor Southerners did not have any other choice. They had to join when they were drafted. However, if you were a wealthy Southerner, if you owned a plantation that had 20 or more enslaved people on it, you could actually be exempted from the draft. And so a lot of Southern men started to complain that this was a war started by the wealthy Southerners but fought by the poor Southerners. To put a simple way, rich man's war, poor man's fight. Now, as the Civil War is continuing, a lot of Southerners are also facing shortages of necessities. Remember, most of the mills and the factories are up north, and so they're facing a lot of difficulties finding the things they would normally have, but also basics, food, salt, anything. And this is partially due to the fact that the Northern Navy was in a lot of ports, blockading the ports. Also, we saw land being reclaimed by the Union, so that land was no longer sustainable for farming. And the fact that enslaved labor, of course, was way down as they either took over plantations or ran for the border. So non-slave owners felt they were being sort of picked on during this, that the wealthier Southerners were getting all the benefits, while the less wealthy, poorer, non-slave owning Southerners were being forced to basically pay for their fair share and also the fair share of the wealthy people. Now, while Congress was borrowing money to finance their war, their Congress was not a huge fan of passing taxes. And if you remember, this was one of the big deals with the Articles of Confederation, was that the Articles government could not pay taxes or pass taxes. So we're kind of seeing, again, this is the problem with a strong states sort of government, is that when you need to pass something big and national, it's really hard to do. Instead, they started to increase the number of paper money that they printed off, which really by the end of the war was not even worth the paper it was printed on. It was worthless, more or less. And they paid farmers for their goods with these worthless Confederate dollars. And the cost of living and eating was so high that food riots actually broke out in a lot of the bigger southern cities, including Richmond, where Jefferson Davis lived. There was women who were at the front of this. And so while slavery was important to the Southern mindset, non-slave owners did not want to fight in a war in which they had no stake and in which they seemed to be the ones who were being picked on the most. And so this led to sort of a morale drop on the Southern side. So here are Union soldiers actually sharing their rations with Confederates during a time when basically, after these Confederates surrendered, they didn't have the food in order to survive, and so the North is kind of keeping them alive. And here is a food riot, a bread riot that happened in Mobile, Alabama, I believe, but it also happened in Richmond, Virginia. And a lot of these food riots were led by women. And my first thought when I read that is, how's that for the cult of domesticity coming back at you a little bit? Despite their claims of putting individual liberty before anything else, one individual liberty you could not have in the South was showing support to the Union. This could be punished by jail time, fines, even execution, definitely being shunned by the rest of your community. However, there were peace movements and secret societies, pro-Union societies, meeting throughout the war. Some Southerners even headed north to fight for the Union. By the end of the war, hundreds of people in the Union were arrested, and more had been forced to run. By the end of the war, some 50,000 Southerners had ended up fighting for the North. One great example is George Thomas. He was a Union general known as the Rock of Chickamauga after his fighting at Chickamauga, which I believe was actually a Union defeat, but he got a lot of good press from it. He was a Union general born in the South, and when most of the rest of his class at West Point deserted, he stayed in the Union. Or most of the rest of it, not his class, but his company, deserted. He stayed with the Union and is considered one of the great Union generals of that time period. He stayed with the Union throughout the entire thing. We also see that there were some Southerners who pretended to be loyal to the South, but were actually spies for the North. And one of the great examples of that is Elizabeth Banlieue. She was a socialite in Richmond and also the leader of a spy ring. She was able to secure a job for one of her former enslaved people, a woman who we believe was named Mary Elizabeth Bowser. Mary Elizabeth Bowser got a job within the Confederate White House where she pretended to be illiterate. However, she was quite literate and had a photographic memory. And so Mary Bowser memorized entire pages worth of documents and listened in on conversations at the dinner table and passed it on to Vanloo, who passed it on to the North. Now, just as much as Northern women, Southern women were also suffering during this time. They were forced to take care of the farms while the men were away. They volunteered their services. Some of them worked for the Confederate government. They sent aid to soldiers in the field, sending food and dressings and supplies and whatever they could, basically. We also see that some women were spies, spies for the South. Women like Rose O'Neal Greenough and Belle Boyd. Many Southern women were also working for the Confederate government, like I said, although they were not in the higher echelons, they were doing a lot of the daily sort of administrative work of the Confederacy. So here's Rose O'Neal Greenough, who is a Washington, D.C. socialite and a spy for the Confederates. It's believed that her information that she slipped to the South helped them win at Bull Run, the first big battle of the war. Later on, she was captured. She fled into the South. Eventually, she went off to England on a speaking tour, trying to raise money for the Confederacy. And on her way back, her ship sank and she drowned. And actually, the story is the reason she drowned was because her dress was full of gold that she was sending back to the Confederacy. Now, with their husbands at war and they were unable to run their farms by themselves, many Southern women had to mobilize politically. They went to the Confederate government and they demanded aid, and the Confederates were basically like, yeah, we're going to have to help them. And as the war continued and the body count continued to rise, many women openly expressed their unhappiness with the current state of the South, and some even started to say that, the rebellion was not worth the cost that they were having to pay for it with lives. So, as the Civil War went on, the Southern need for manpower took a very strange turn. Some Southerners started to talk about freeing and arming their enslaved men, which is not necessarily out of the question. It happened during the American Revolution, for instance, but it definitely would be a sharp turn from what had happened before that. This didn't really happen until almost 1865 when they started to get really desperate at the end of the war. And it happened so late, it was hard to tell whether or not this would have become a thing. But they did try to arm some of their enslaved people and promise them freedom. Also, to many whites, this threw off the entire, mindset of the Confederacy. This was anathema to the entire Confederacy. One guy, Howell Cobb, a Georgia politician, said that if slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. We got it wrong if we're doing this. So, what's his name? Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, once said in one of his speeches that the great truth of our nation is that the black man is not equal to the white man. So making him equal in war goes against the entire theory of the Confederacy. Now, let's look at a couple of military turning points here. In 1863, the Civil War was very much undecided. People thought that, the manpower of the North is obviously going to win. But no. This was a war that could go wrong very quickly and was going wrong for the North. If you think about Ambrose Burnside and his huge defeat at Fredericksburg, Burnside was closely or soon replaced by Joseph Hooker. Hooker, however, didn't have any better luck. Hooker led his men against Robert E. Lee. He marched them into Virginia. Robert E. Lee was outnumbered 2-1 at this point, but he split his forces, circled behind Hooker, caught him off guards, and defeated him very badly at the Battle of Chancellorsville. This battle is sometimes called Lee's masterpiece. The defeat was absolute. However, the one thing that Robert E. Lee lost in the Battle of Chancellorsville was his right-hand man, a guy named Thomas Jackson, who got the nickname Stonewall at the First Battle of Bull Run. Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own troops. He lost his left arm, and later on he died of pneumonia soon after that. So here's the Battle of Chancellorsville. This is the forces engaged and also the forces who were casualties and the main players. And here is Stonewall Jackson, 1824 to 1863, from Virginia, where he was a general in the Confederate Army. He got his nickname for standing like a stone wall at Bull Run, although some people said that was a compliment. Some people said that meant he was slow and that a Southerner gave him that nickname out of spite. He was also accidentally shot by his own troops later during the war. And here's where his arm is. Sometimes history gets weird. Here's the grave of the arm of Stonewall Jackson. So, after this victory at Chancellorsville, Lee felt that his chances were good enough that he could attack north, perhaps with the hope of easing pressure on the South, perhaps even the possibility of threatening Washington, D.C. itself. So Lee headed north, and finally he was intercepted by our new general. So Joseph Hooker is fired, and George Meade becomes the general of the army. And they meet up at a small college town called Gettysburg in Pennsylvania in early July of 1863. And this is the largest battle ever fought on American soil. Over 160,000 soldiers total were involved in the war at the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg is a 3-day battle. Day one, they basically meet, they fight, they start to, pick their places to battle the next day. Day two is a close thing. The South nearly wins on day two of Gettysburg, but a last-minute textbook maneuver by a guy named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain saves the Northern Army. I love Gettysburg. I'm sorry, I could go off on 45 minutes, so I won't. But Chamberlain maybe saves the entire Union Army that day. And on day three, after being able to move the Americans from their positions on the high ground around the hills and the mountains around Gettysburg, Lee ordered a direct charge on their entrenched positions, which, if you remember, Bunker Hill, and if you remember Fredericksburg, remember how I told Burnside never attack uphill into an entrenched position? Robert E. Lee, never attack uphill into an entrenched position. Do not do it. And this was called Pickett's Charge after the guy who led the charge. Pickett's Charge ended with a Union victory and a Southern defeat big time. Pickett's Charge was a disaster. It was a bloodbath. And so Lee fled back south. This is still considered Lee's high watermark, the moment where he got as close to victory as he ever would before or after Gettysburg. So here is Pickett's Charge, which again, don't do it. Uphill, bad idea. On July 4th, as Lee is retreating from Gettysburg, Ulysses S. Grant is having his own success in the South, in Mississippi. Grant finally captures the city of Vicksburg, which he's been surrounding for months now. He's been trying to get in. He tried a full frontal attack. He tried to wait them out, and finally they were waited out to the point where they had to surrender. And so the defeat at Gettysburg and the surrender of the Confederates at the Battle of Vicksburg, both on the day of July 4th, 1863, is one of the most important days in American history. And this was a body blow for the Confederates that they could not recover from, although the war would still go on for another 2 years. This was a major turning point right here. It also meant that the Mississippi River was open for the Union Army to move men and supplies up and down. So here's Vicksburg. You can see that the red line is the trenches and the defenses that they built around the city, and the blue lines are all of the Union waiting to try and get in there. Now, in 1864, even after these two huge defeats, the war was not over. Lincoln fired George Meade, again, another firing. Meade had refused to pursue Lee out of Gettysburg, and so Lincoln finally had had enough. He brought in Ulysses S. Grant from the West, and that is the last time that Lincoln goes shopping for a new general. So instead, Ulysses S. Grant is pursuing Lee through Virginia, and he did so without hesitation and without stop. Somebody mentioned in one of their My Two Cents that, can't it be a good thing to retreat? And yeah, it can be. However, retreat wasn't really part of Grant's DNA. He continued to push forward no matter what. Even if he lost a lot of men, he could replace those men. There was a larger population and immigrants coming in to the north that helped him replenish his army. And so he lost tens of thousands of men throughout the months that he's chasing Lee. But he basically said, this is the cost that we have to pay in order to beat the South. Grant suffered 18,000 casualties in the Battle of the Wilderness, with Lee suffering only 7,500. But like I said, Grant is refusing to retreat, which makes him very different from all the other Union generals that came before, even when he's defeated or when he's losing men by the thousands. Although this does get him some bad press in the North. He's sometimes called Grant the Butcher during this time. But he just kept pushing forward, saying this is what we need to do in order to win. Eventually, Robert E. Lee was able to get himself dug in around the railway city of Petersburg in Virginia on the way to Richmond. And so Grant tried to attack him again head on, but it didn't work. And so instead, he had to just sort of wait Lee out. He had to encircle him instead. Meanwhile, in the deeper South, in Tennessee and Georgia, Ulysses S. Grant's friend and second in command, a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman, marched out of Tennessee into Georgia, and his orders were to destroy everything in his path. And that is exactly what he did. This is a tactic we call total war. The idea is to make life so horrible for the people that they have no other choice but to surrender. Not only the opposing armies, but the opposing civilians too. This is dirty war tactics right here, but it was they felt a necessity. Sherman burned farms, he burned cities, he burned Atlanta, he burned Savannah. He destroyed railroads. He would superheat railroad ties and then bend them around trees. They called those Sherman neckties. He would cut down telegraph wires. He would steal food and valuables from farms. They did not bring food with them, so instead they ate off the land, and apparently, according to Sherman, they ate very well. Sherman believed that the worse the war was, the sooner it would be over for everyone. So here is William Tecumseh Sherman, 1820 to 1891, from Ohio, where he was a major general during the war. He was Secretary of War after the war, and later on became the head commander of the army after the war as well. His brother actually was a senator from Ohio. We're going to get to him in the 1880s when we get to the Sherman Antitrust Act. He also lived in St. Louis for a while, too. He's actually buried in St. Louis at Calvary Cemetery, along with Dred Scott. So here is Sherman's march through the sea, starting in Chattanooga, working his way to Atlanta, to Savannah, and eventually up through the Carolinas, just burning a path through the South. This march to the sea was a military victory. It destroyed a lot of the Southern will to fight, definitely, and it also destroyed a lot of cities. However, it had a secondary goal, which is the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, because at this point, Lincoln had lost a lot of battles. He'd lost a lot of men. He was not very popular. Lincoln assumed he was actually going to lose when he ran for re-election. So he wanted to make sure that things were good enough when he left. Instead, he started to win. We start to see that with Sherman winning, that this helps put him over the top. And he beats out George McClellan, his former general, who was running as a Democrat and calling for peace with the South. And this call for peace really rankled a lot of Northern soldiers who mainly voted for Lincoln, because they were basically like, what, you want us to, we did all that fighting for what, so that we can make a peace negotiation? No. That is not what we are going to do here. And so Lincoln actually won pretty well in 1864, as a bit of a surprise to someone who was looking at him in 1863. So here is a pro-McClellan political cartoon where Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis are tearing apart the map of the country. Lincoln saying no peace without abolition, Davis saying no peace without separation, and McClellan trying to hold them both together, saying the Union must be preserved at all hazards. So let's look at how this is a rehearsal for Reconstruction. As the war was starting to finish up, more of the Confederacy was falling to Union control, and the Emancipation Proclamation had to be enforced. And we're starting to see that the North is thinking about how are we going to bring the South back into the North, but also how are we going to protect the rights of these recently freed, enslaved people. And so Northern soldiers started the business of freeing enslaved men and women. And this would lead to a lot of debates over who had power, who had control, what rights do African Americans have in this new country, and we'll see this again during Reconstruction. One famous example of this is the Sea Islands experiment, where black Reconstruction was attempted off the coast of South Carolina. They had been abandoned by the plantation owners since the beginning of the war. However, enslaved people were basically left behind, and so soldiers and land speculators started to land in the Sea Islands, leading to the question of who gets the land and how during this. Believing that the first step towards liberty is education, we also see a group of abolitionist black and white educators coming down to the Sea Islands to educate the newly freed enslaved people, believing that that's the first step towards full citizenship. So here are the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, including Edisto and Hilton Head. A lot of these are prime spring break real estate these days. So other Northerners believed that the transition of freedom came from basically teaching them how to do a job that, that many of them already knew how to do, which was farming, basically. And so when it came time to sell the Sea Islands, most of them went to white investors, not freed slaves. This Sea Islands experiment was kind of a mixed bag altogether. Freedmen got education, they got jobs, they got a better standard of living. However, at the end of the day, they weren't owning a lot of their own land. And nowadays, a lot of these islands are, like I said, prime spring break real estate. So we're seeing that, we're kind of seeing almost like these are the after effects of the Sea Islands experiment even up through today. Now, in areas like Louisiana and Mississippi, things are a little bit different. Freed slaves were forced by the Army to sign contracts that basically forced them to go back and work for plantation owners, which they were not overly pleased with, many of them. They would be paid, and physical punishments were outlawed, but neither side was very happy. Freed blacks didn't like the fact that they were right back where they were before the Civil War in the plantations. Whites thought that freedmen were now insubordinate because they couldn't basically beat them into working. However, a few plantations were able to make a success, including the Davis plantation, the former home of the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and he sold it to his former enslaved people after the war, where they became known for growing some of the best cotton in America, and therefore some of the best cotton in the world. Now, the treatment of African Americans was an important sticking point during this time, though, and new Reconstruction plans being proposed by Lincoln and the Radical Republicans often had to do with how African Americans would be treated post-war. Lincoln put forward his own plan for Reconstruction, which we'll talk about more when we get to our next chapter after Christmas, but he put forward the 10% plan of Reconstruction, which said that nearly all white Southerners would get their land and their property back except for the enslaved people that they used to have, if 10% signed a loyalty oath to the Union. And once 10% of voters signed that loyalty oath, they could elect a state government. It was a very quick and easy way to get the South back into the Union. That was Lincoln's main idea, is like, we got to get them back. We got to reunify the country. However, it did not offer very much in the way of guaranteeing the rights of freedmen. Meanwhile, radical Republicans in Congress, the ones who are sometimes called fire eaters, were heeding the call of many African-American abolitionists who said they wanted to put forward their own Reconstruction plan that was much more harsh, called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill would require 50% of voters, not 10, to sign loyalty oaths. It also forced them to make guarantees of black equality before the law, although it did not call for voting rights, not yet. So we're seeing it called for punishments for people who were not treating African Americans well. So the Wade-Davis Bill passed through the House and passed through the Senate. However, Lincoln refused to sign it, and this was coming up right at the end of the congressional session, so it died. This is what we call a pocket veto. Basically, Lincoln put it in his pocket. As the war ended, though, it was very clear that slavery was ending too, but the status of the formerly enslaved, are they people, are they citizens, what are they, who are they, is still remaining very unclear. So here are Lincoln and Andrew Johnson trying to stitch the country back together, trying to mend it. Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, actually did used to be a tailor, so it's interesting that they make him the one who's stitching the country back together. Now, after Lincoln's re-election, the war headed towards its end. We were very close. Lincoln was elected in 1964. The war ended April 1965. Sherman is continuing his fiery march throughout the South. He is destroying Savannah. He's moving up through the Carolinas. He captures Charleston, which is where the whole Civil War started in the first place. And then on January 31st, 1865, Congress also passed the 13th Amendment banning slavery within the United States. In total, so the Emancipation Proclamation freed some citizens, or freed some African Americans. freed some enslaved people. The 13th Amendment frees all enslaved people. It says slavery is not part of our nation anymore, except unless you're a prisoner. That's what it keeps out. So here are some of the places. We already looked down south at Sherman and his march. Here we see Grant around the wilderness and around and around Petersburg, and we see him eventually moving towards Richmond and eventually towards Appomattox Courthouse, which is going to be the end of this war. So in April 1865, Grant finally broke Robert E. Lee's defenses at Petersburg and made it to Richmond. However, this was not his end goal. This is how Lincoln and Grant thought the same way. They thought the problem's not Richmond, the problem is the enemy in the field. And so he continued on and continued to chase Robert E. Lee until finally he captured and surrounded him at the Battle of, it wasn't really even much of a battle. It was at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, 1865. This ended the Civil War. Even there were a few enemies out in the field still, but by April the war was pretty much over. So here are Grant and Lee at Appomattox. Now Lincoln, unfortunately, didn't live much longer to see the end of this war. He was killed very shortly after the victory at Appomattox Courthouse on April 14th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth. And it was supposed to be part of actually a massive assassination plot. They wanted to kill Lincoln and his vice president and the Secretary of State and Ulysses S. Grant all in one night, but all the other targets survived. But this really kind of puts a crown on the end of Lincoln's life, that he was beloved after the war had been won. He was sainted almost after his death. He was less of just an assassinated president and more of a martyr to the cause of freedom after this, even with Reconstruction being uncertain. So here is Lincoln on his deathbed. He was moved to a boarding house across the street, and ironically, this same bed that he died in was one that John Wilkes Booth slept in a while before. And so here's Abraham Lincoln with much of his cabinet and his son, Robert, and slowly passing away at about 7 o'clock in the morning the day after he was shot. According to Ulysses S. Grant, who traveled the world after his presidency, the impact of the war really had a sort of positive spin, especially in Europe. He was greeted as a military genius and as a savior of democracy and as a nation builder throughout England and Germany and other places. Since he was the right hand of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln was seen in the same way. Lincoln is seen as our greatest president at this time, and sometimes still at this point. So the world was watching and waiting to see how all of this would end. As we're going to see, we're not entirely sure. Okay, I said Johnny Appleseed here, but we're going to make that the right quotation. Let's finish the semester off right, people. What do you say? So this is actually Frederick Douglass, there we go, who said that, "Verily, the work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but it only begins, and we will continue that work next semester, everyone."